We're gonna see how this goes. It's my first car video, and I have a really shitty mount, so my phone's gonna shake a little bit. Sorry for those of you who get motion sickness easily. Your energy and the protection of that energy is very vital to your success spiritually and life in general. You have to be able to cultivate your attention and direct it to where it will serve you best and to where it will serve those you love best. And first and foremost, you have to make sure you are good before you can make sure anybody else is good. And you do this through like little mental checks. You can do this through many different means. It's just when you come to the realization that we are spiritual and emotional creatures deep down, that's what we are. We are the soul. And we experience these emotions that oftentimes leave us feeling trapped in our own heads, especially when it comes to the ego. The ego is really good about making you feel two opposite emotions at the same time. It's really good at making you feel like you need to do one thing, but then you're afraid of doing that thing because of another reason. But then you're afraid if you don't do that thing, and you're afraid of the fear of doing that thing, and it becomes this deep well of emotional shit that you have to like guide yourself through. And so it's not easy, because what you're doing when you're controlling your energy and you're controlling where you give your energy to is you're controlling the emotion that you put into people, places, things, hobbies, whatever it may be, and you're controlling your emotion around that. And this doesn't mean that on the things you don't want to give your emotion to, that you're completely emotionless towards them. It means that when you feel those emotions come up about a problem or a person or a circumstance or maybe a conversation, that you're able to recognize you're having that feeling, determine whether it's positive, negative, or whether it's going to serve you or not, and you're able to let it go. And you're able to let it out of your mind. And let those thoughts revolving around that emotion, don't give them validity. Let them be as they are. Let them just be thoughts. It becomes a state of flow. Push you back a little bit for more stability. It becomes a state of flow and a state of being. Because when you think about it, right, you are not all of the thoughts that you have, and you are not the emotions that you have. You are not the phases in life that you go through. You are not the past version of you. You are not the future version of you. You are the you that is now. So stay with me on this. The you that is now is a metaphysical soul. It's not your body. It's not your thoughts. It's not the emotions you're experiencing. You are the being. The being is the key word there, that experiences all of those things. Not just the experiences you have in life, but the emotions, the thoughts. And the reason I say that is, if you notice, when you get thoughts in your head, sometimes they have a different voice. Sometimes when you have these thoughts that come into your mind, you can observe them and see them as not you. You can tell when it's a different part of yourself, right? I believe it was Carl Jung that talked about how there's more than one part to the self. And you have the soul, and this is just my interpretation of it. You have the soul, you have the ego, you have the dark self, and then you have the collective, which is all of it together. The soul is going to be your truest self, the soul and the heart. That's where your truest self is going to come through. And each one has a voice within you. The ego is usually the loudest, The shadow or the dark self is the most intrusive. It comes at random times, and it's like a what the fuck moment. It's one of those moments where it's like you don't know what came over you when you speak out of the shadow or you speak out of the dark self. And then you have, the soul. That's the quietest voice out of all of them. At least I've found in my life and then in other people's lives around me. You want to amplify your soul voice as much as possible. And a lot of this is easier for women than it is for men, because men are not as instinctual or intuitive as women are. It's just by nature in our biology and the way our brains work. We're a lot more analytical. We're a lot more practical. We're a lot less emotional or feeling oriented. And that's all intuition is a feeling that inclines you on what to do in a particular situation. So we are not as in touch with our intuition, so it is more difficult for us. But on the other end of the spectrum, it's more difficult for women to have that more practical or step-by-step analytical side of them. That's why we complement each other, and that's why men and women need each other. You want to amplify this soul voice or this voice of intuition that's within inside of you. And I think the easiest way to do that is to, when you start having thoughts and you start hearing these voices in your head, try to categorize them into the ego, the dark, or the soul. Sorry, a little bump there. The ego, the dark, or the soul. And once you start to do that, you start to understand what each one sounds like. You start to understand what each one says and the way that those thoughts present themselves. Like how the ego will argue with itself because it's a circular part of the self. It likes to, the ego is crazy. It likes to use past things against you while also making you fearful of what the future holds. So it'll use the past to make you change the future, but then it seeks pleasure, and so you stay stuck in the present and where you are, where you don't want to be currently. And when I'm talking about shifting, like I'm talking about being, right? And this thought just came to my head, like being here now, being in the present moment, being you, being that soul self. You want to try to shift your state of being from the now to the self you envision that you are in the future, not the self that you're currently going to be in the future, right? So let me break that down. Your past self is the reason and the amalgamation of why you are who you are today, right? Every circumstance that you have in life, the way people perceive you, the way you perceive yourself, your entire sense of your world, your universe is because of your past self and who your past self was. So we can see that and realize that if we are our current selves, we will continue in the future to get these results. We will continue to be this person because there's no change, right? There's no difference in who we are. So I say that to say that you have to shift your state of being in the now to a state of being of who you want to be in the future. What does that person do? What do they sound like? How do they think? What do they do to take care of themselves? What do they do to take care of those around them? What do they do to love well? What do they do to love themselves well? Because you cannot love well if you do not love yourself well first. So you have to create this clear mental picture in your mind of what this being of you is like, this version of your being in the future. You have to accept that as who you are now. You have to come to the realization that you already have that potential within you, and it's just a mindset shift. It's just the way you think. It's the way you go about doing things, right? And I'm going to rescind my statement. It's not the way you think, it's the way you are, the way you be. And that's a weird thing to say, but when you understand and you feel it, it's a sense of flow, and it's a sense of being. You just are that person. You don't have to try to be that person. That's what that flow is, right? That's what, like, and I'm not gonna say you don't want to. demonize your current self or your past self. You never want to demonize or outcast or label any version of yourself, past, future, present, as bad or good or anything. You want to remain completely neutral to it. Because if you want something too much, it will evade you, and if you try to escape something, it will chase you. So you want to remain in that middle ground of neutrality, as this is just how it is. This is just being, right? So instead of being like, oh, I really fucked up back then, I really made really poor choices back in the day, and man, I was such a shit person, like I was such a horrible individual. Don't use that language around it. Because if you use that language around it, you're not able to be grateful for that version of you that made you who you are today. Because you probably came along, you did some shitty things, or you were a terrible person, or you weren't performing at the level that you are now, right? You weren't doing something that made you who you are now. And those experiences, that version of you, led you to a point where you made a change, whether you realized it or not, and that change is what made you who you are. So, by domino effect, your past self made you who you are today. Whether that's where you wanted to be or not. You were a reflection of your past self. And there becomes a tipping point. There becomes this tipping point where you either, one, remain that way and you accept that as your state of being, and whether you do this consciously or not, it does happen, or you change. And there's a fundamental mindset shift, and you start to understand what being is, and you start to listen to that soul voice. If you stay tapped into that ego, you're going to stay in that same place, because the ego is circular. So you're going to be circular. You're going to continue doing the same shit. You're going to continue having the same habits, the same thought processes. You're going to wonder why your life doesn't change or get better. And then you're going to get to the end of your life and you're going to be like, what was it for? What was the meaning of any of it? And I could get to a higher level of talk and be like, well, technically there's no meaning to anything that we experience in the physical world, because it's all temporary. The only permanence is impermanence. Nothing lasts forever, except the soul. That's all that you have for eternity. We need more talk like this in the world. And I think Christianity, I think modern Christianity, and this is just my 2 cents on it, gets a lot of things wrong when it comes to the idea of self. Like, it's a very binary system of sinful nature and the Holy Spirit, and it's a very binary thing, which I don't really think that it's fully binary. I don't think you can label it as just the sinful nature, because the ego is a convolution of both. The ego alone is proof that it's not both. The ego's motives are often very difficult to sniff out, very difficult to understand and define. I think this is just a video of me, like, letting my consciousness flow and letting my mind run and trying to speak from the heart as much as possible. But I guess in the end, what I'm trying to say is, like, you need to start categorizing these voices that are in your head. And this isn't saying you're schizophrenic, you're not fucking crazy. Everybody fucking has this. Everybody has these voices. Like, their intensity is very much dependent on your neurochemistry and, like, your past experiences, your trauma as a child. There's so many different factors that go into it. You want to try to get back to your childlike state of wonder. And a lot of spirituality talks about this, like the childlike state of wonder, the unimpressioned mind, the true self, the true being, was when you're a child and you could experience life unhindered without care for others' opinions, without care for society's opinions or society's constraints on who you are. And when you were at your youngest, your drives and your passions and like the things you wanted to do, exploring. And like for instance, I'll give you a story. Like I would go out when I was a kid, and I had several different like obsessions when I was a kid, right? I would be obsessed with like wanting to be a Lego master builder when I grew up, right? I wanted to be like, what's his name? Sean something. He's like been with Lego and worked with Legoland for 40 plus years now. He's been their main designer for Legoland and a lot of the pieces that went into Legoland. And it's just art through Legos. And I was really obsessed with that as a kid. I was really obsessed with golf as a kid. I was really obsessed with wanting to make movies and be a director when I was a kid. I would make short films. I wrote a whole like 20-minute short film script out, like page by page. I figured out how to write a real script, and like I formulated all these things, and I would do all these things, or I'd like want to make little stop motion movies with my Lego figures and things like that. Or I'd want to explore, go out in the woods and just like experience the woods, experience nature. And that childlike sense of wonder, that childlike sense of bliss and being, that escapes us as we grow up. As we become teenagers, or as we become, I would say anywhere over the age of 10, you start to be impressioned by the world around you, by your parents, by your friends, by other family members. And you start to take on these personality traits of the people you grew up around. That's why you oftentimes are compared to your parents and being like your parents. And what we also tend to do is rebellious stage in our teenage years is we start to move away from what our parents try to make us to be, because we feel our childlike self, it's a battle that happens with our childlike self and the impressions of the world, the impressions of our parents. And I'm not saying all of this is bad. Like, I'm not saying like all of this conditioning is bad. Like, I would say there's some good conditioning. There's some good things. But most of the time, it's not what's going to clarify your mind. Like, most of the time, parents don't know how to raise a kid. It's their first time doing it. I'm the oldest out of me and my sister. Like, my mom didn't know what she was doing. Single mom. She didn't know what the fuck she was doing. And like, she just did the best that she could, and I'm grateful for her for that. But as you go through your teenage years, you start to have this rebellious stage because your inner self is fighting with what your parents tell you to be like, or how they're impressioning onto you, or your friends. Or maybe there's a core group of friends you identify with, and you take those personality traits on, because now there's so much convolution within inside of you of who you are. Because of all these voices everywhere, you just latch onto the one that makes you feel the best. You latch onto the one that gives you the most sense of oneness with yourself. But it's not really you. It's not. And it's not until you discover these voices that are within you, and these conditionings that have been set in your ego. And your ego is literally just the part of you that has been constructed by everything outside of you. The ego is not of origin to who you really are, to your soul. The ego is simply the angry teenager, simply the stressed adult who doesn't know what they're doing, simply the other impressions put on you by society, by your parents, by your friends, by broken heart relationships, by people you've been with, people you've hated, people you've loved. The ego is the cesspool of all of that. And that's why it contradicts itself, because it comes from everywhere. It's everything outside of you. The ego is without you. And so you start to, at some point in your life, you'll come to realize that you have the ego. And once you can pin down its voice, you have to remain conscious of it, because it's tricky. The ego likes to come in through the back door, and it makes itself appear as if it's really you, but you can feel that it's not. That's why feeling is so important. That's why the intuition is so important, is because you can feel that it's not you. And these thoughts come into your head, and at first it's like, oh, that seems rational. And that's the ego telling you it seems rational. Oh, that makes sense because XYZ happened. That's the ego. It all comes back to support itself because the ego wants to be alive. It wants to sustain itself because the ego needs existence. And it'll always be there. It'll always find some sliver, some tiny portion of your life that's barely significant to sustain itself. It will always find it. So start to differentiate, start to listen to these voices in your head and start to determine, okay, what's an intrusive thought from my dark self? What is an ego thought? And how does that ego support itself? It's a very complex structure. Listening to the ego, which is probably the loudest voice, is going to be the hardest thing for you to do on your inner work. It's going to be the most difficult fucking thing, is to understand the complexity of the ego. But just remember this, nothing you need to fix or understand yourself, I'll say understand and come to know, come to realize yourself, is outside of yourself. Nothing you need to understand or to realize who you are comes from outside of you. It is all within. That's a little hack for you. I wouldn't say hack. Hack's a bad word. It's frowned upon in the spiritual community. That's a tool that you can use to understand in a framework, a mental framework you can use to understand the ego. The ego will try to come outside, is outside of you. And it'll try to sneak in and make it sound like it's from within, but it's not. So, I think that's all I have. I'm not going to make this run on too long. Just some things that were on my mind. I hope everyone has a blessed day. And go outside, enjoy the weather. All weather is nice weather because it all has an intended purpose for the betterment of the world. So, have a good day.